Hello and welcome everyone to our second Global 60s Colloquium. We're very happy to have Sarah Miles with us today. And Sarah is a scholar of France and the Francophone world in the 20th century with a particular interest in intellectual history, decolonization, and print and reading culture. She's currently finishing her PhD at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she's working on a history of transnational print networks and militant publishing in France, Quebec, and Algeria in the 1960s, in which she seeks to explain how print media contributed to the emergence of solidarity necessary for anti-colonial internationalism. Having spent 6 years teaching as a graduate instructor and fellow in the history department at UNC, Miles is now the co-director of the UNC's history department's digital history lab. She provides training for faculty and graduate students in digital humanities, develops digital pedagogy with faculty, and handles social media and outreach for the department. In the past, she's written about interconnected histories of print, intellectual history, and global revolution in Haiti, Quebec, France, North Africa, and beyond. She's published several peer-reviewed articles and edited chapters, presented at numerous conferences, and produced various public-facing works such as, and let me just give you a few, French, African, and Arab Negotiating Post-Colonial Algerian Identity and Revolutionary Africain, Revolutionary Papers Radical History Review, published in April 2023. Books and Bombs, Franco-Algerian Collaboration and the Reconstruction of the Bibliothèque Nationale d'Algérie in Tocqueville 21, online February 16, 2023. The People Have Spoken in Africa as a Country, Revolutionary Papers last summer, and last but not least, To Cross the Ocean, René de Pastre, Anti-Colonial Writing and Global Francophone Radicalism in Journal of Caribbean History, published in 2020. Now, her recent book review on Salomon Daisy's Red Internationalism, Anti-Imperialism, and Human Rights in the Global 60s and 70s will be featured in the next issue of our Global 60s journal, and should already be available online on our website, I believe. Additionally, Sarah has written an article entitled Selling Revolution, Advertisements, Marketing, and Network Building Amongst the Radical Left Press in 1970s France, which has been accepted by French politics, culture, and society, and will be published soon. She's today talking about reading the revolution, militant print culture, and transnational organizing in the 1960s, and I'm very happy to give her the floor now. Sarah, take it away.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that introduction. Let me share my screen and then we can get started. Do that and that. Awesome. So yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you everyone for being here this morning or afternoon or whatever time it is, wherever you are. So I'm excited to present some of this work to you and then to hear kind of thoughts, questions, commentary, have an open discussion at the end. So there's a documentary that's made in 1970 that takes you sort of through a bookstore. And at one point, the camera pans over young men and women reaching for items. They're kind of perusing tightly packed bookshelves. And after a few moments, the camera zooms in as one hand kind of reaches for a book and flips it open, and a voice begins to speak, superimposed over the image. And it says, quote, "It's a certain act of magic, thinking that when one acquires a book, either by buying it or stealing it, we acquire what lies within it. One doesn't even need to read it," the voice continues as the shot pans over to a middle-aged man wearing a kind of pale cream-colored turtleneck. It zooms in on his face as he smirks and says, "The magic act means that just by grabbing the book and putting it on your bookshelf, you already possess what's in the book." So the voice describing that magical act is that of François Maspero. He's a bookseller and an editor who is based in Paris. In 1957, Maspero founded a bookstore in the heart of the Latin Quarter, which was called La Joie de Lire, or the Joy of Reading. A few years later, he founded a publishing house. Honestly, at the time, it was more, as he put it, for the kind of appreciation of a good quality book than because he really thought it was going to launch him to international fame. But little did he know at the time that that's pretty much what this enterprise would do. So produced in 1970, as I said, the documentary in which Maspero kind of ponders the magical act of acquiring a book was entitled Les mots ont un sens, or Words Have Meaning. It was directed and produced by Chris Marker, who's an artist and filmmaker affiliated with the sort of French New Wave left cinema, and more famous for works like La Jetée in 1962 or A Grin Without a Cat from 1977. But Words Have Meaning was one of a series of sort of concerted efforts by Marker and by a group of other left-wing sympathizers to provide Maspero with financial and political support in a moment when his editorial venture was kind of in crisis. So like much of the radical French left in the early 1970s, Maspero was really struggling. In the wake of the student and worker revolts of 1968, the French government had embarked on a campaign against left-wing print media and left-wing organizations in general, hoping to kind of root out the revolutionary youth movement once and for all. As the publisher of many a censored periodical and book, Maspero in the early 1970s faced the prospect of hundreds of thousands of new francs in fines and several months in jail. He had dealt with this before, having had more than a dozen books seized during the Algerian War for Independence, but the struggle in the 70s was made more acute because of a kind of dramatic change in the French left. So where before students and revolutionaries went to buy books from Maspero in droves, in the years after 1968, young radicals in the Latin Quarter actually made it a habit to thieve books from Maspero's bookstore, citing the idea that it was sort of unfair that someone be profiting from the sale of revolutionary ideas. But really, for the decade or so before Marco's documentary was released, readers and visitors, as I said, felt basically the opposite, right? It wasn't unfair, but was actually an incredible opportunity to have Maspero's bookstore there. So for them, in the 60s, Maspero wasn't a struggling bookseller profiting off the back of revolution, but rather a symbol of hope and optimism, a source of revolutionary information, and a model of global intellectual exchange for Marxists and anti-colonial militants around the world. So personally, I think Maspero's case is interesting in its own right. There's sort of shadowy intrigue of police seizing books, bombings by terrorist groups of his bookstore through the 60s. He goes to Cuba, to New York, to all these other places. And there's a sort of who's who of anti-colonial movements, militants who stepped from his bookstore in Paris, not to mention this kind of dramatic fame and fortune shift over the course of the 60s and the 70s. So I care about that just because I care about that. And I think, obviously, who wouldn't want to learn more things about this kind of weird, unassuming, bespectacled old Frenchman who was doing all these odd projects and how he was achieving it. But I do realize that not everyone is a French historian, and maybe not everyone inherently wants to learn just about the nuances of this particular case. And perhaps in the conversation, in the context of a conversation about the global 60s, as we can see from that, it's worth thinking about how his experiences are linked to a much broader story about books and radicalism in this era. So why should you care about Maspero? And what does the story of his publishing house tell us about the broader history of transnational organizing in the 60s? Well, for one, his model of dissident publishing really inspired other editors around the world. It was unique for its ideological line or lack thereof, and it had a distinct, recognizable visual signature that other publishers replicated. Second, the vast scope of information contained in Maspero's books created an intellectual world that expanded beyond national boundaries. So books helped readers see their community quite broadly and really connected them to comrades around the world in the 1960s. And finally, Maspero's bookstore is an example of something that's true of other radical bookstores in this period as well, of how bookstores become sites of collaborative organizing, of militant socialization, and of solidarity that informed how the left evolved over the course of this decade. So over the course of our time together today, I'm going to go through kind of each of these points and hopefully help you come away with kind of a better sense of why we should care about Maspero, certainly. Hopefully you care about him a little more than you do now at the end, but also more broadly, why we should think about books and publishing, not just as a source of information about the global 60s, but actually as a central mechanism in the creation of a radical movement that was imagined by people at the time as global and as kind of a vital part of international revolutionary sentiment. So to kick us off, I want to tell you a little bit about where les Éditions Maspero came from and the related bookstore La Joie de Lire, and how this kind of strange man went from building an internationally renowned, went about building an internationally renowned publishing house. So Maspero, who you can see in the central photo there, was born in 1932 to a family of academics, but his childhood quickly turned pretty chaotic with the outbreak of World War II. His parents sent him out to the countryside to avoid the worst of the turmoil of the war in Paris, but Maspero's older brother, Jean, joined the resistance and actually was killed au Maquis in the early 1940s. His parents, meanwhile, were deported for having hidden Jean's resistance activities. His father, Henri, was a renowned sinologist and member of the Académie Française, and he died in Buchenwald in March 1945. His mother, Hélène, was deported to Ravensbrück, but survived and returned home to Paris to actually write these like amateur histories of the French Revolution that are super interesting. All this to say, World War II decimated Francois' family and set him kind of a bit askew when it came to figuring out after the war ended what he was supposed to do with his life and his career in the early 1950s. He describes himself as being a sort of failed academic. He kept forgetting when his exams were. He never managed to remember where he was supposed to go for his agrégé. He failed math tests. Wasn't really working out for him. So he decided instead in the early 1950s to kind of settle down, buy a storefront, get some stability in his life. As he described it, he had at the time no real love for books, which is ironic, but nonetheless founded his first bookstore at the age of 22, and in 1957 expanded to a larger storefront in Paris's Latin Quarter, which became La Joie de Lire. So from its inception, La Joie de Lire was a kind of magical place, home to revolutionary books, to radical magazines from around the world in dizzying arrays of languages, and it quickly became a meeting place for left-wing and anti-colonial activists passing through or living in Paris. So Amilcar Cabral, it would rub shoulders with Aimé Césaire, Jean-Paul Sartre wandered the aisles with Léopold Sédar Senghor. I don't technically know if every single one of them was in the place at the same time, but like all of these people did actually demonstrably go to the bookstore. So we know that they kind of all existed in the same space in one way or another. So a few years later, in 1959, Maspero finally decided that he wanted to expand his business, not just selling books, but actually creating them as well. So with the support of his then wife, Marie-Thérèse Senez, Maspero published the first book under the label Les Éditions Maspero, which was Paul Nuzan's Aden Arabi, which is kind of interesting novel about a bourgeois Frenchman who tries to escape the turmoils of French life by going to what he calls Arabia and discovers that, you know, this mythological freedom of travel is actually not very real. But it's actually more important for the fact that Nizam was a member of the French Communist Party in the 30s and the 40s, and was eventually kicked out for critiquing the Soviet Union. So this kind of anti-party dissident line was present in Maspero's work from the beginning through his publication of Nizam's Aden Arabi. So what really launched Maspero to fame, rather than just the aesthetic quality of this first book, though, and its kind of importance, though he did manage to get Sartre's introduction for Aden Arabi, so clearly had some good connections to start with. But actually what launched him to fame was how he engaged with a much larger conflict taking place at the same time, which was the Algerian War for Independence. So his first foray into the ongoing kind of police action, as the French government called it in Algeria, was the production of a book by an anti-colonial militant who you may have heard of, Frantz Fanon. So Maspero actually read a note in L'État Moderne that said that the Martiniquan psychologist had just completed a new manuscript, and he took a risk and reached out to Fanon himself. And you see kind of a quote from the letter from IMEC on that slide there. So as Maspero explained, the series he had just created, in which Aden Arabi was the first book, was, quote, dedicated before all else to the defense of liberties. He would be happy, he continued, should Fanon accept to, quote, immediately put the book under contract and prioritize its release before all others. Such was the importance he saw in what Fanon was writing. So Fanon happily accepted the Maspero's offer, and as luck would have it, kind of launched the editor into the world of dissident publishing and legal trouble that eventually made him quite famous. So over the course of the War for Independence, Maspero published many, many more titles about the ongoing violence across the Mediterranean. Of these, more than a dozen were seized at printing by the French police, censored for supposedly encouraging desertion from the military, presenting a danger or threat to state security, or lauding violence against the state. Far from abandoning these projects, though, the state repression, and you'll see this, I mean, I suppose you won't necessarily, but you do see this if you read Maspero's letter, the state repression really just made him angrier, which is kind of how this works for Maspero, and really more dedicated to making sure the public had access to this information. So over a few months after the publication of Fanon's work, he developed a pretty complex network of international editorial supporters, a sort of print-based porteurs de valises, or these suitcase carriers who smuggled, more well-known for smuggling bombs and money and guns across the French border during the war. So whenever a book was censored, from Maurice Machinot's Le Refus to Georges Mattei's novel Disponible, Maspero called on one of these editorial friends in Switzerland, in Italy, or in Germany, and asked them to reprint their own version of the text, and then mail him and his allies batches of the books in small bundles, or give it to one of these porteurs de valises to smuggle back across the border in the backseat of the car. So thanks to this publishing network, La Joie de Lire, despite French censorship, remained a place where sympathetic comrades could find information about the Algerian War, even as the government did their best to shut down news about what was actually going on. So by the time Algerian independence had been achieved, Maspero had proven himself to be a dedicated publisher of anti-colonial texts and a creative resistor of government censorship who could kind of mobilize a pretty vast network of supporters to contribute to the project of revolution that authors and dissidents were undertaking around the world. So this is really what made Maspero's publishing house not only influential in France, but really a pretty important model for other left-wing revolutionary ventures in the rest of the world. So he wasn't alone in producing radical texts. Obviously, there are other left-wing bookstores that have existed since the left have existed broadly. But there was something kind of unique about Maspero's political and commercial project that made him especially influential, which is a fact regularly recalled by colleagues from the 1960s. Actually, in a recent interview that a friend sent me, renowned intellectual and radical Tariq Ali explained to Sebastian Budgen of Verso that, quote, Maspero was a huge inspiration on every level. A, in the quality of the books he produced, and B, some of the cahiers that he produced, these kind of short, sharp books or pamphlets on ongoing causes. Ali continued, Maspero was a very big influence on the founding of New Left books and provided information about what could be and couldn't be done. Similarly, one member of the Front for the Liberation of Quebec, Jacques Lantou, cited Maspero as an inspiration for the publishing house he established in the 1990s, saying that he created his own publishing house, quote, in Maspero's honor. So what is it then about Les Éditions Maspero that was inspirational for other editors, and why did they see it as so groundbreaking? So I suggest that there are kind of two main reasons. First, how his publications engage with contemporary political struggles, and second, the lack of political line across his series. So first, Maspero's books were really uniquely committed to political engagement in the present. And we see this in the case of Fanon. So Maspero explained what he saw as the purpose of books in a succinct editorial note that preceded Fanon's Year 5 of the Revolution. He wrote, Fanon's book is useful. It had to be published, and continued, the very spirit in which we created Le Cahier Libre made publishing Fanon's book an obligation. So according to Maspero's second wife, Conchita Gonzalez Battle, this was the only consideration that ever mattered for Les Éditions Maspero's editorial board throughout the 60s. If someone thought that the book was well written, that it wasn't redundant, right? There were 12 other books on the topic Maspero had already produced, and could contribute to an ongoing movement, out it went in the world. Didn't matter whether it was contradictory with another piece, didn't matter whether or not some person preferred something else. If it was useful, if it could matter to a movement, out it went. So Maspero understood books to be not only places where one could analyze the past, but also spaces where solidarity could be built in the present, and therefore a vital contribution to these ongoing movements. So the second aspect of Maspero's publishing house that was especially inspirational was kind of paradoxically its lack of political line. So as I said, various political parties, right, have always kind of had publishing houses. So the French Communist Party, French Socialist Party have had publishing houses, though with weirdly limited success. But these are always kind of subject to a certain political oversight, right? Denying the right to publish books that don't fall in with the party line, and often using their productions to critique or ostracize people who didn't agree with their particular politics. So having himself been kicked out of the French Communist Party in the early 1950s, Maspero was kind of part of a generation of leftists who eschewed the major political parties and instead adhered to a broader ideology of revolutionary internationalism. So his books then spanned the revolutionary left, coming from Trotskyists, Maoists, Leninists, progressives and labor activists, cultural critics, economists of all stripes, really anyone and anything that was on the left, broadly construed. This often, you might suspect, drew ire from plenty of party members who were upset to see their books produced alongside those of rival factions. But it was precisely Maspero's refusal to commit to a specific political line and desire to support as many debates about as many aspects of the left that he could that really inspired new leftist publishers in the Western world. So of course, each of these public publishers had their own local political issues, their own missions. But if you take a quick glance at some of them, you can see kind of a shared left non-party ideological purpose. So the New Left Review, according to their own website, was founded from two journals, both committed to rejecting the dominant revisionist orthodoxy within the Labor Party and the legacy of the Stalinism in the Communist Party. And according to Stuart Hall, one of the founders of the New Left Review, the organization was created as part of an attempt to define a third space between the legacies of colonialism and the impositions of the Soviet Union. Similarly, in a retrospective by Paul Sweezy, one of the founders of the Monthly Review, he explained that, quote, one of MR's tasks has been to use Marxian methods to track and understand major developments on both sides of a polarized world and to celebrate the successes of third worldism where possible. So whether they were founded in light of Maspero, like New Left Books, or were joined by him on the same path, these publishing houses shared a commitment to Marxist humanism and kind of broad-based socialist analysis that might provide commentary and tools for others, but specifically avoided prescribing specific actions or outcomes within the confines of the socialist left. So in the 1960s then, a series of radical publishers really come to the fore, right? Both in Europe and in North America, as well as in newly independent nations in the global South, all of whom were ideologically either inspired by Maspero or kind of moved towards that position over the course of this era. And many of them developed quite concrete relationships with the French editor, translating works from one another or collaborating in various ways. So this included New Left Books, the British publishing house and precursor to Verso, Éditions Maspero, a revolutionary nationalist publishing house in Quebec, Verlag Wagenbach, the German experimental publishing house founded in 1965, Casa de las Americas, a Cuban internationalist publishing house founded by Hedy Santa Maria, or the Swiss publisher La Cité Éditions, founded by Niels Andersen as part of the kind of anti-Algerian war efforts. Other publishing houses, meanwhile, that existed before pivoted to a similar model to Maspero, including Italian publisher Giacomo Feltrinelli, the American publisher and periodical Monthly Review, the German literary publishing house Suhrkamp Verlag, and various others. So considering that all of these publishing houses, as I said, regularly communicated with one another, contracted with one another, not to mention translating and publishing one another's works, it makes sense, I would suggest, to think of them as a sort of intellectual unit, right? Not just incidental things that happen in each place, but actually part of a connective, like a kind of important connective node that actually links all these different places and plays a quite similar and intentionally shared role across the global left in this period. So political line, kind of model of dissonant publishing, all these were really important, but not just, they were not the only ways that Maspero's example transformed the kind of broader world of leftist publishing. So now what you'll see here is just a very quick sampling of some of the books that I took out from the publishers that I just mentioned. If this was a class, I'd ask you to contribute and wait until you said something. Obviously, I won't hear. But take a second to look and think about what stands out to you when you look at these books. For me, it took a minute when I started Googling to realize that they're not all from the same publishing house, right? They look really similar. And I argue then that one of the other major points of influence from Maspero to other radical publishers in the 60s was that, and then this is also an important contribution to the socialization of militants through print culture, is that these leftist texts were recognizable. So even if you can see some visual differences between each collection, they're marked by a kind of unified style. And certainly the publishers themselves have very recognizable styles, right? So you get this big orange band across Parti Pris works. They always had these kind of blank slates with a singular color across the middle. You see Maspero's Petite Collection, right? Singular color, little text. That and Suhrkamp Verlag look very, very similar. So big titles, simple covers, singular colors, usually a watermark or color block that let you know quickly who had published a book. So when you picked up something from Parti Pris or from Suhrkamp, you knew who had published it. And even today, if you're wandering around used bookstores in Paris, you can immediately kind of spot a Maspero in the wild, right? Very bold colors, often kind of color gradiated, and there's a little man emblazoned on the bottom of the spine. So this was particularly influenced by Maspero's Petite Collection Maspero, which you can see on the left there, which provided affordable versions of historic texts and reprinted cheap editions of bestsellers. But these books really shared a particular visual repertoire. And I argue that this provided a sort of symbology of the left and allowed for a public performance of politics through print. So if somebody was walking down the street or sitting in the metro reading one of these books, you could immediately guess that it was one of Maspero's or one of Suhrkamp's or the latest from the Monthly Review. So why does this matter? Well, on the one hand, it strengthened local community because it meant that you could immediately kind of recognize somebody else as being of your tribe, broadly construed, right? It allowed for kind of a public performance of politics, so other people would know which side you were on if you were headed to a protest. But it was also really vital in the context of an increasingly international and really global revolutionary movement. So when books consumed by leftists started coming not just from a local party, but from all around the world, with authors that people might never have heard about because they were originally written in another language and just being translated, or they were a figurehead for an up-and-coming movement that you might or might not know about. Knowing that a trusted editor published the book actually came to take the place of what authors might have done in the past. So creating a distinct visual style thus helped readers say to themselves, all right, well, maybe I don't know who César Vallejo is, or maybe I don't know who Pierre Valliere is, but if Maspero put it out, then sure, yeah, all right, maybe this is somebody who's on my side, who might share my vision and who might be worth looking at. So in short, these kind of shared visual repertoires shifted public trust to the publisher as a conduit for legitimacy in a world where the volume of available print material was so high that it would have been impossible for a militant reader to know exactly who or what they should be reading if they wanted to be ideologically coherent and kind of get sympathetic explanations of global affairs. So left-wing editors, of course, wouldn't have been successful if it weren't for these readers walking down the street with the latest edition of the New Left Review or the Petite Colloquium tucked under their arm. So I want to consider then the second major kind of point about editors in the 60s, which is how reading and writing about the world contributed to a shift in perceptions of community and of solidarity. So the map that you see here represents a really pretty small sampling of books published by Maspero. So his publishing house put out more than 1,300 books in about 20 years. And their location on the map represents the book's subject, right? So they're all obviously published in Paris, but represent discussions of all these various places. So as you can see, the topics of the books published by Maspero really span the globe. So if, say, in 1969, you were to wander one of Maspero's storefronts in Paris and take quick stock of the shelves, you genuinely encounter the kind of world in print. So if La Joie de Lire felt like a home to you, if you were a sympathetic left-wing comrade, you might be inspired to believe that all of these books were relevant to you and that all of these affairs and movements and revolutions were relevant to you. So looking at catalogs from other left-wing publishers in the 60s, like Wagenbach, Batzipri, etc., the world is similarly represented. They represent a particular vision of the world, of course, kind of skewed towards the global south, skewed towards formerly colonized countries, in newly independent states or amongst nationalist movements, skewed towards their own affairs, but nevertheless provided readers a way to think about their homes as part of a broader universe of people and a truly global movement of revolution. So in print, we can see a sort of imagined nation, if you will, but without national boundaries, right? Tied together by ideology rather than by citizenship. So whether they were producing original studies of diverse places or publishing books in translation, radical publishers were bringing the world home to readers and encouraging them to think of themselves as part of a world beyond their local community or national boundaries, and really part of a global movement of emancipatory politics. So in producing texts about the world, publishers produced a vision of global exchange and made it literally possible to do anti-colonial internationalism. So thinking that the revolution was taking place everywhere all at once required, after all, people to know what was happening everywhere all at once. And moreover, by investing in books about these places, by buying books about them, taking time to read them, people could increasingly feel that they were in solidarity with other radicals, that they had invested in their revolutions, even if they weren't able to travel abroad to fight them. So this also contributed to people's perceptions of themselves as working in conjunction with others, that their actions at home, even if it was just buying a book, was inspired by those in other places, and that these other worlds were connected to their own. So in short, as Maspero said in Marco's documentary, just owning a book, having it on one shelf, conveyed a sort of magical power. And what, after all, is solidarity, if not a somewhat mystical, somewhat magical faith in the idea that your freedom is tied to that of somebody else? So in this particular case of Maspero, but also across leftist publishers in the 60s more broadly, the publications in the books really allowed people to think of themselves as part of a global community. So in addition to the production of books and the creation of this kind of global imagined community of readers, there's one last thing that was especially influential about militant bookstores like La Joie de Lire, which was its role as a site of socialization and organization for leftists in the 60s. So in the days before the internet, before cell phones, when, as those of us who've worked in the archives of the 60s know, communication was still done via telegram or letter, or occasionally a phone call, it was pretty difficult to get in touch with other people, right? All these things required you to already have a connection with the people to whom you wanted to speak, Maybe you had a friend of a friend or access to an address, some way to get in touch with somebody in a radical movement that you wanted to get involved with or be sympathetic to in other places. But you had to at least have something to send a letter to, hope you'd get a response, right? It's kind of a crapshoot in some ways. As travel got easier for some people in the 60s, that meant that they could go to these other places and actually perhaps become invested in foreign movements. But spaces of socialization in the kind of context of global travel become really important for radicals who might go to a new city, want to get a sense of the lay of the land, find information about local struggles, or make connections with comrades, but not necessarily know where to go or how to get kind of involved in that. So radical bookstores were uniquely practical places for this project. For one, the address of the store was marked on the books that were distributed around the world. So if, say, a Marxist from Mexico City had read a little bit about French labor movements and was traveling to Paris for the first time and had found a book at home from Maspero, they would know where to find La Joie de Lire, right? The address is just on the back cover. You know exactly where to go to find the purveyor of this book. And there's no need for a phone call or a friend of a friend or to learn the name of the local cafe where the Trotskyists hang out if you want to go meet people and kind of get a sense of what's going on. In addition, bookstores provided a casual excuse to dawdle and spend leisurely time, a plausible reason to return day after day that didn't require the permission of a university or spending money at a restaurant. And bookstores also hosted or advertised events of interest, as you can see from the poster there, for an event at Maspero's. So there were speaker series, book signings, fundraising campaigns, all of which could be of interest to a traveler and advertised as bookstores. And finally, these bookstores particularly fostered a space of exchange where it was socially acceptable to talk to strangers, to ask somebody for a book recommendation, to strike up a conversation with somebody glancing at an interesting text. And for those of you who've traveled to Paris or maybe to New York or various other places, you know that that's probably not really the energy that most public spaces in Paris give off, where it's just easy to strike up a conversation with a random stranger. But they're really intentional in these bookstores, La Joie de Lire in particular, about creating such an atmosphere of exchange. So La Joie de Lire in particular dedicated specific spaces for visitors to deposit their own books or pamphlets that might be of interest to other customers, really fostering this kind of participatory exchange in a unique way. So one French-Canadian radical living in Paris in the 60s recalled visiting Maspero's, as he put it, quote, to deposit brochures, tracts, and all material on solidarity with Latin America that I was translating and printing at my own place. So basically, bookstores serve as kind of clearinghouses for radicals on the move, right? Creating an opportunity to build connection and organizing across movements where otherwise communication might have been difficult. According to one radical, Maspero's bookstore was so well known as a place to go connect and to learn the latest gossip and make useful connections that even the French police went there for this purpose. He recalled, quote, the policemen from the Renseignements Généraux went there, in fact, to keep up with what was being plotted or discussed amongst leftists in exile. Similarly, when people traveled abroad and became sympathetic to a movement taking place somewhere else, when you came home, your local radical bookstore like Maspero's had developed a reputation as the place to go to learn about those affairs and to stay connected. So there's this great story about a French woman named Nelly Damonville who spent a few weeks in Quebec in the mid-60s, actually as part of a choral group. And while there, she read a few issues of the nationalist magazine Parti Pris and took stock of what she described as the oppression of French-speaking people in the province. When she returned home to Paris, she later recounted in a letter to the editors at Parti Pris, she went straight to Maspero's and says, quote, I was able to find several numbers of your magazine at La Joie de Lire. So for Nelly, and for certainly plenty of other folks who've noted the importance of La Joie de Lire and other militant bookstores and memoirs, letters, personal recollections, these were really vital sites of information and interconnection. So if we want to know how it was that leftists in the 60s found one another, where they went to learn about the world, and why they came into contact with ideas that might have seemed wildly out of place otherwise, well, it's in many cases, right, the same place that many of us still go to when we want the world to come to us, bookstores. So if La Joie de Lire was a little unusual in its originality, it certainly wasn't the only other bookstore doing this in the 60s. L'Agence Livre Français in Montreal, Third World Books in Algiers, in the United States, Black and LGBTQ-owned bookstores, internationalist bookstores in capitals and small towns around the world, all of these served a similar purpose for the many, many people who weren't going to be able to circumnavigate the globe, but still wanted to find like-minded people and information about foreign affairs that they wanted to coordinate with, help organize, or support in service of kind of a broader international socialist revolution. So as you can hopefully glean from these various little anecdotes and stories, Maspero was both representative of and influential in the development of a kind of unique culture of left-wing publishing and reading in the 60s. Despite its successes, however, Maspero's story has its tragedies. As I kind of started this presentation out talking about, in the 1970s, the combination of increased government censorship and fairly unrestrained thieving from the bookstore on the part of young radicals created a pretty substantial financial blow that Maspero quite barely survived. Only with the support of people like the documentarist Chris Marker and many of the authors with whom the publishing house worked did he actually manage to keep it in business. By the end of the 1970s, however, Maspero was pretty exhausted. He eventually sold the rights to his publishing house to an enterprising young leftist named François Maspero, and after changing its name to les Éditions de la Découverte, Maspero ensured the continuation of Maspero's legacy, and Découverte is now actually celebrating this year its 40th anniversary. So just as a last note, I want to sort of recognize, right, that those of us who study the 60s know that, at least age-wise, this is a pretty difficult time for this generation of radicals. They're getting kind of up there, right? So I want to end my talk today then by recognizing and reflecting on two people who passed this year, actually, who were kind enough to talk to me when I was doing research for this project, kind of entertaining wild questions and speculations and providing helpful advice and direction. So one of those is François Maspero, the successor to les Éditions de la Découverte, and the other, who I mentioned very briefly in passing, was Panchita Gonzalez-Battle, who was Maspero's second wife, but more importantly, an incredible translator of books from about 6 different languages. She published regularly and wrote for Maspero, translating pieces of Catalan poetry. She was the first to translate some of Guevara's and Castro's writings into French. A truly dedicated translator, talented radical, and a really powerfully joyful woman. So both of them passed away this year, and I just sort of wanted to pause and recognize that as well. So thanks so much for your time this morning, afternoon, evening, whatever it is for you. As you can likely tell, I'm super interested in these topics and how they intersect with global histories of radical publishing, not just in France, but in other places as well, theories of solidarity and of community. So I look forward to questions, thoughts, ideas, conversation, whatever y'all want to do. And thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for this wonderful presentation. I have a lot of thoughts and questions, obviously, and I can barely contain myself. But we just sort of, ask for everybody's patience and explain to you how this works. So we obviously, since this is a webinar, have the Q&A box. You can sort of add your questions in writing in there. If you feel especially daring, you can also raise your hand or tell me in the Q&A box that you want to address Sarah directly, and I can give you the right of voice, I think. So any and all of these things are possible. But let me kick it off by asking, I was really intrigued by the idea of this being an imagined community and and both an ideational space as well as a physical space, of organization and travel, and truly, having that sort of global ideational and physical network is quite spectacular as an argument, to put forth in terms of the global 60s. But were the editors, that you were referencing, for example, that I thought that was all very interesting, that you sort of looked at the visual design of, the publications. Were the editors fully aware of each other? Were there potential meetings, congresses or conferences? You hinted at the fact that there was mutual inspiration, obviously, but was there also physical correspondence and contact between them?
Yeah, absolutely. All the ones that I've mentioned had really robust and regular practical correspondence. In many cases, they were negotiating translation rights, negotiating practical publication rights of like who got to own what copyright where. But for many of them, they would seek out authors from their own countries or their own kind of movements that they were most closely connected to. So for the French, that might be Algeria, that might be labor movements in France. But in order to publish things from other places, they relied on this network of international publishers. So Maspero was the first to publish Castro and Guevara in French, but he gets the copies of those books from Casa in Cuba. And they've already published them in Spanish, and he's sort of he writes regularly to Casa, figures out from these other publishers, right, what's the lay of the land in your place? Who's worth publishing? Who should I make accessible to my people? And the same is happening in these other spaces as well. So when people in Quebec want to know what's going on in Germany, they may or may not actually have the resources to translate from German themselves, but they'll reach out to other publishers, figure out, you know, what are the big 3 books that we should be putting out and making available to our people. So there's pretty robust correspondence in the archives. There's also various kind of publishing conferences and book conferences. I think Maspero gets his start at the Frankfurt Book Fair in the early, like his 59 or 60. Some of his earliest catalogs are actually mostly available in the German literary archives because they got saved from the Frankfurt Book Fair. And there's a book fair in Montreal in the 60s. So there's kind of these like spaces and moments where people can also actually literally come together. And we have pretty good evidence that people did actually happen to meet one another, or when somebody from Germany went to France to go do something, they would have a meeting with Maspero, or they would sort of find a way to get together.
Fantastic, thank you.
Yeah.
All the questions are pouring in. So the first question, Matthias Marambillo, many thanks for the presentation. Could you talk about the archival work that's behind your research and the methodological and practical challenges of this kind of transnational and multilingual approach?
Yeah, that's a great question, and sees through precisely what the issues of this kind of work are. And I'm sure other folks who work in the global 60s, right, know that this is definitely one of the central challenges. So my archival work has been primarily in France and in Quebec. I still hope to be able to go to Algeria to do more of the work there, though between COVID and l'Irak, it was pretty difficult actually to cross borders. So eventually that is on the list. Because of Maspero's role as kind of global clearinghouse and international clearinghouse, I was able to get a lot of things from the French archives. But a lot of it has actually been kind of an exercise in cobbling together archives from radicals themselves who have been good enough to have an eye for the future and think to keep things. The convenient thing about books as well is that all of Maspero's works have a dépôt légal, right, like a legal obligation to be deposited in the French National Library. So spent a very, very long time in the French National Library reading through many a catalog of books. But then otherwise, when you're trying to find letters between people who wanted to publish with Maspero or with Parti Pris or some of these other editors, and smaller periodicals and publications that might not have appeared in the French National Registry or the Canadian National Registry, that's where really these like smaller left-wing groups come in. So l'Institut Tribune Socialiste, which is a privately run organization with former members of the PSU in France, have a phenomenal archive that they just sort of collected from their members over time. Similarly, Archives Revolutionnaires in Quebec is a privately managed organization that has sort of collected private copies of periodicals and publications over the years, and has actually, I think in April, they're opening like a physical storefront in Montreal that you can go visit and use their archives. So there's a lot of these kind of private archives that I've been able to get in touch with, find friends of former participants in these movements who could kind of tell me where to go and figure out where these collections might exist. As far as the methodological and transnational and linguistic challenges, it's part of why I'm going to say only 3 places appear in my dissertation. I don't think only Algeria, Quebec, and France are involved in the networks that I look at for this particular project, right? I know that they're also talking to publishers in the Caribbean, publishers in French West Africa, right? Like all these other places are also involved, but you got to draw boundaries somewhere if it's going to be a coherent book. So that's sort of, I knew that there was robust exchange between these places. There's a way to kind of envision these as relatively demonstrative of the processes that I'm trying to explain. So I chose those places to create some boundaries. But as you can imagine, there are so many things that you could include, right? So many different places and projects, and particularly for the 60s, right? And looking at publishing, there's thousands upon thousands of documents that you could read, dozens and dozens of different periodicals that would kind of broadly fit the bill. So I started with Maspero because I knew that he was kind of the most influential and in many ways kind of one of the earlier publishers in this movement, and then really just followed the breadcrumbs in many ways of who was he talking about regularly, right? Who appeared the most often in his catalog, who seemed to get the most space in his publication Partisans, and then saw where I could follow it from there, basically. So I'm sure there's a dozen more things I could have looked at, but that was my attempt to create some boundaries around this.
And that's very much appreciated, obviously. But this is also room for growth and expansion for other people also to contribute then.
Yeah.
Here's another question, Teddy Pekin. What about the impact of Maoism on Maspero, and how come Maspero was more impactful in Francophone world, in the Francophone world over the Anglophone world?
Yeah. So Maspero, as I joked in the presentation, he's really sassy. He's really quite grumpy a lot of the time. So Maspero himself really quite hates Maoists. He gets really bothered by them. He thinks they're too petty and too factionalist, and they don't ever pay attention to the practical things in life. And kudos to his commitment to this kind of broad-based ideological project. He still publishes a lot of Maoists. So he's still very committed to making sure that that position can get out in the world and that people can still access their works. Personally, he really detested them. So I think, as I say, the fact that he's able to provide an opportunity to access information is really important. But I think it's hard to say on his politics himself whether or not like specific factions had an ideological impact. And I'm trying to think, the second half you said was like,
well, the second half I made a mistake. I think the question was how come Maoism was more impactful into the Francophone world over the Anglophone world?
That's a great question. I think, I'm sure other people could answer this question better than I, but I would say that my gut instinct is we know that the French left is really quite, is struck quite a blow by revelations about the Soviet Union's, system of gulags and imprisonment. They really, really struggle with the Prague Spring. So there's this kind of like lack of, and by the late 60s, there's a void that develops in terms of places to be inspired by. And I think there had been quite a reliance on the Soviet Union. So I think there's many people who abandoned the Soviet Union as a dream and are maybe shopping around for other examples. Though the influence of third worldism is also super important there, right? Because China becomes a pretty important influence, say in Algeria, right? The kind of post-independence Algerians are really inspired by Maoism as well. And the fact that the French left is really involved in global South movements, in West African independence movements, and these kinds of things, and that they're drawing from Maoism probably also means that there would have been more exposure to people trying to enact Maoist principles on the ground. There are people who do more direct work on this who might have other thoughts about that question, but that'd be my off the bat.
Great, thanks, Sarah. There's another question from Mika Robbins. Thanks so much for a fantastic presentation. Did the bookstores you study have the means of publication on premises, and did they allow patrons to use them? I'm thinking of mimeograph machines in particular. I know this was a practice in some radical poetry bookstores, such as the Pisa in New York City, but I'm curious if this was done in more overtly political bookstores.
Yeah, that's a great question. So you're totally right to point to mimeograph machines as a really important source of practical tools for publishing. I know for other places beyond France, they become really, really important. So actually the first printing of Albert Mimy's work in Quebec is actually mimeographed totally by hand in somebody's house and then like distributed on the street. So that's a really important source of kind of pirate printing, if you will, to be able to provide access to texts that might otherwise not have actually been produced by a formal publishing house. So I know it's important in the Francophone world as well. Otherwise, so Maspero starts out actually physically making his own books. He would create the first copy, he designed the covers, et cetera, et cetera. By the mid-60s, he never printed the full runs himself. He contracted with printers. And by the mid-60s, he moved some of that out to other people as well and kind of shipped some of that process out. It's a thing, honestly, if anybody here has thoughts about it or more information about it, the role of printers in these processes is something that I'm super interested in and have really never been able to find much information on. So you'll see at the back of some of these publications, they'll note, right, printed at XYZ person's location store, usually kind of outside of Paris on the outskirts and then brought back in. But I know for a fact that many of the things that were seized were actually seized at the printers rather than actually getting to Maspero. So you had to register where your books were being printed, and then the police would actually go to the printing house and take them rather than waiting for them to get to the bookstore to take them from the bookstore. So they must have been controversial, right? They must have been spaces where police raids were happening. Printers were obviously taking a risk if they were putting out things like, you know, Fanon was Year 5 of the Revolution is not a subtle title. So you knew, right, what was being produced. You knew that you were taking on something that might be subject to seizure. So I think they play a really important role in this, and I have really yet to be able to find concerted information about who people who were printing this actually were and how they understood their role in the process. So I don't have a great answer for you, but I think you're onto something that's a really important part of what's going on here as well.
Great. So Sarah, let me ask you another question. I was really struck by the map that you've unfolded, the argument that you made, that on this map you essentially see all the publications from Maspero that talk about all these locales all over the world, and I love the argument that you are creating not only that ideational network, but you also bring the world to you as the customer, as the patron of that particular bookstore. Now, in my own research, I found it fascinating, not only that these channels of information were coming, to a specific locale, but also how they were framed and contextualized. So in other words, the prefaces, the epilogues, the sort of commentary, that precedes the actual translations and these texts, I oftentimes found much more interesting than the texts themselves, because they give you a clue in, how the selection process, unfolded, where the emphasis and the focus was set, and why this particular text was so important at the time in the eyes of the publisher or the editor. Are you looking at the texts that are selected by Maspero also from that particular perspective? And if so, what does it tell you about the world that they're trying to create, or the world how they see and interpret it with respect to their own local situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do look at that, and I'm totally with you. It's so fascinating. Like, I feel like there was many a day that I just requested every book from Maspero I could from the BNF and was just like glancing through all the prefaces and conclusions and seeing what notes existed. So I think there are two things happening that I noticed in this, which is socialization and organization matters a lot. So who is leading the series that a book is created by? Who is friends with friends who know the author who's putting this together is often how this gets put out. You'll sort of you can retrace, if you follow particular editors, like Mimi, you would write to people, find out who was important in, say, Tunisia, and then bring something back to Maspero. And you sort of see in the introduction this kind of description of this is the foremost person from this place, and therefore we need to learn about them. And I think one thing that really comes out of these prefaces that I find striking, and that is sort of a main point of the project that I'm working on right now, is that they're always framed not just as something that's important to know about abstractly, intellectually, for the sake of knowing about other things and being worldly, but they're always framed, and I think you were getting at this, as part of your struggle, right? As something that's important for you. And so I developed this idea of commensurate solidarity, right? So solidarity that's not just something that you're doing on behalf of somebody else, but actually solidarity that is enacted because it's central to your own liberation, and that learning about these other places becomes part of what's happening at home, even if it doesn't seem like it immediately has kind of anything to do with it on the surface. And I think that idea really comes out in the prefaces and in the conclusions, where they're saying, not just you should learn about Cuba and here's this book, but rather you need to know about this because we can't do things here without knowing about these movements. So I think that's really, really fascinating. It comes out in these. The other thing that is maybe less coherent of an answer that I was struck by when reading these, and eventually when talking to Fanchita, is that I really wanted there to be strategy. I wanted them to have some sort of intention, right, in what they were actually putting together, and some sort of plan for, okay, we need this many Trotskyists book this week, and we need this many Maoist books next week to make sure we're being back. And I asked Fanchita, I was like, what does an editorial meeting look like for Maspero? Like, do you have weekly board meetings in which the editors get together and like discuss what's being put out? And it was so beautifully like the 60s as we imagine it in the most stereotypical form. She's like, no, obviously we didn't have like bureaucratic meetings. Like sometimes somebody would bring something to Francois and he would be like, yeah, good. We don't have anything on that réunion. Cool. If you think it's fine, it's fine. And truly it seemed to kind of be a free for all for whatever editors who worked on the board broadly thought was important got put out. And so I think there's maybe a lesson in that answer of always attempting to define somebody's ideological perspective, or like there's this singular purpose to what people are doing. And I think, there's 10 or 12 people that worked on the editorial board for Maspero at the peak of its production, and all of them were putting out what they thought were important. So I think there are times at which remembering like there's maybe not as coherent of an ideological line as we would always like there to be can be useful as well.
No, I completely agree. I mean, I think that a contingency factor there is very,
Yeah.
very strong. But I like what you said about, also the socialization, the idea that it has to fit the local framework somehow, that there is sort of, I almost felt at times the global becomes the vehicle to address the local. And,
Yeah.
all of a sudden, the global is, becoming a frame. Not that that solidarity isn't perceived as strong as it has been articulated, but the way it's connected locally tells us oftentimes more about the local needs or the local sort of dynamics than about the global or the international. But yeah, that's a fascinating element. I think there's another question, Mika Robbins. Is there a real difference between left-wing publishing networks and practices and right-wing publishing networks and practices? Or is the phenomenon you describe a general tendency within political alternative underground publishing as such? In other words, are there radical right-wing examples of the same strategies you analyze in your presentation? It's a great question again.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think what is distinct about this particular kind of new left project of the 60s, as I was saying, is the lack of ideological line, in the sense that there is an ability to create a really global movement that can also have a lot of intellectual and political diversity. I think my perception would be that right-wing publishing projects and networks, such that I've read about them, are probably closer to networks that exist between political party networks, right? So like the Communist Party has various publishing houses in various countries amongst different national organizations, and they're obviously collaborating with one another. So the French Communist Party's publishing house is going to draw from other people's publishing houses. I don't know of, though I'm happy to be corrected, a similar kind of global right-wing perception, right? So you might have multiple fascist parties in multiple nations that are interacting with one another. But I think the nation also takes so much precedent and has such an important place to play in right-wing movements in this period that I don't necessarily know that there is a sense of that kind of commensurate solidarity, right? That every other country's movement is exactly as important. And there's probably likely to be a little more importance of domestic affairs in right-wing movements, though we obviously know that, various counterintelligence practices and whatever were internationally connected in the 60s as well. So yeah, I think my instinct would be to suggest that there's a better comparison to be made between like socialist party publishing networks and right-wing publishing networks as kind of party organizations with maybe a narrower base of connection that's much less kind of broad scope. Everything can be under the same tent, as was the case with ones more like Maspero's.
I think that's a great point. I mean, I do think that there's always a lot of research that can happen with regard to the conservative movements and the conservative, especially grassroots organization, the youth movements that may emerge in parallel or in response, to what we see in the left.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a great element of the global 60s to look at also the other side of the political spectrum.
Absolutely.
Well, we are way beyond time, but that's testimony to how inspiring your presentation was. So thanks so much, Sarah. I mean, we can't wait for the book to come out, obviously. So you have to come back when the book is out and tell us a little bit more about that. But thanks so much for a wonderful presentation, a lot of food for thought, and a lot more, I think, to talk about, in the various facets that we've covered, only, glimpses of, I think, in this conversation. To all of you, thanks so much for joining. We'll be back next semester. Please go to global60sjournal.com to see the lineup for next semester. And thanks so much for your attention and participation. Have a great rest of the evening, the day, or whatever time it is on your end globally. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, y'all.